Hi, I'm Professor Jason Leggett, and in light of EcoFest this week, I wanted to share a environmental law case with you, and just to try to give you a perspective of the importance of what's called economics theory in both law and society. You'll see economics theory in sociology, in criminal justice, and you might think about it in terms of the rational actor. So the general kind of underlying principle is that people act in their own self-interest, and that they maximize the benefits in their choices and they reduce their costs as much as possible. So we want to see how that works as it applies to environmental law. So the title of today's lecture is called Toward an Economic Interpretation of the EPA versus Homer City Generation. So I want to start off with just kind of a real simple set of quotes here by two famous judicial economics professors, Gary Becker and Judge Gary Posner. This comes from a book called Uncommon Sense: Economic Insights from Marriage to Terrorism. So the first one is that the poor were hurt most by the government's failure. This is in response to Hurricane Katrina. You could also apply it here to Hurricane Sandy. We want to think about the government here as an economic actor. So in what ways can they reduce their costs, and in what ways can they maximize their benefits as it responds to the different environmental changes that we face today? The second issue is really involving kind of their relationship to us, right, the residents or citizens. So in economics, right, in the theory of economics, when we talk about democratic participation, the key issue is called access. So access involves the ability of an individual, family, group, or class, or a community, kind of like a neighborhood, to use resources which are directly required to secure the livelihood in a normal pre-disaster time, and as well as their ability to adapt to new and threatening situations such as climate change. Now, just to kind of give you a background then, an economic interpretation, this means that I or others who are applying an economic analysis, we are arguing that human progress is caused by markets. Okay, so the voluntary organizing of humans based on our needs and the production of goods and services to meet those needs is really what drives people forward. So you can think about this word innovation. Usually we refer to it as technology, sometimes in different business aspects. And that's what we're really saying here, is that the market itself is what kind of pushes people forward. And that's what we'll be thinking about today. So if we just put this in historical terms, the major environmental problem that economics is trying to address and solve can be kind of just this idea of that when somebody makes pollution, right, whether it's from a factory or whether it's from water pollution, smoking, cars, right, etc., we tend to think about that as just the immediate person. So I think smoking is a great example there. We tend to think about just the people who are smoking a cigarette. Well, if they get cancer, that's their own choice. Of course, we now know the problem of secondhand smoke, right? So the people around them, right, also get the detriment, right? So they are unable to maximize their benefits because they can't keep away from that person. So a different way of thinking about it is as early as 1905, Canada and the United States, they share one of the largest boundaries in the world. And so industrial development in both these countries along the border, okay, in a humid eastern border region like we have here in New York City, relies on water resources. Okay, and that actually really is not just for us to drink, right, but it's also where they mostly dispose of waste. So that, leads to a decreasing water quality along this border, but it becomes very difficult to say who's causing the problems on which side of the border. So in the interest of both of the countries, to prior to 1905, they'd really only kind of met when there was a serious problem. And so they started to see that this was not a very efficient way of dealing with the problem. So you might even think about, we can extend this, it's not 1905 anymore, right? So here in 2017, you can see this problem now with China. So if you see the headline that's just kind of right over here, right, we've got a problem here. As China's pollution is actually coming all the way across the ocean instead, hitting the shores of Hawaii, hitting the shores of California, Washington State, Oregon. So how do we kind of keep states or corporations accountable when we're not 100% sure where the pollution is coming from? Okay, so you can also see this little image, and these are all of the different types of pollution that can occur in just kind of the industrial survival that we all live in now. So the theory that they're working with is an economic theory called Coase Theorem. And so I can simplify it in two different ways, but I think these images kind of help, right? You see this pollution coming from the factory, it goes in the house, and so what can I do, right? We can't build a wall, right? There's no Trump wall that we could build to stop pollution from coming in. So what can we do? Well, the idea here is that you will put up with a certain amount of pollution, right? A certain amount of detriment or harm, if I can compensate you for it. So, if I can pay you for that harm and you can kind of take efforts to try to block it, or, take extra vitamins or whatever you need to do, that will kind of balance it out. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean it's the most moral thing or that it's the best decision. It just means that this is the most efficient standard within the theory of economics. So the theory stated concretely is, if you will let me offer to pay those affected by my pollution and they accept, that will be more efficient or better, because the cost to the non-consumer producer, which is called an externality in economics, is less than the cost to the producer or consumer if I had to stop polluting. So if I just shut the factory down, right, society would be at a loss. They wouldn't be able to get the kind of products that come from that producer. We wouldn't be able to consume those products. And so the theory goes that we're willing to pay for this externality in order to have access to these products. So in economics, it's always important to identify the economic actor. So in kind of traditional political science, or when we study the Supreme Court, we tend to kind of just put things into two categories. And as you'll see here, there's more than two categories, right? So if we just start with the most obvious, which is the pollution producer, you want to think about it in the state that's upwind. Okay, so this is kind of, I'm producing, let's say I'm New York, right? And I'm producing pollution. It's not going to affect me as much because it's going to go up into the sky, right? You could also think about it as in the water, right? And it's going to go downstream or downwind. Okay, so that would go down to New Jersey, maybe even as far as Maryland, right? Possibly even all the way down to Washington, D.C., right? And so we need some way of identifying, well, who is the polluter? Then you have the non-producer consumer in the state downwind. So if you think about it, right? I think New Jersey is a great example. If you've ever seen kind of the pilot light, burning in the sky in New Jersey, they're refining oil, right? And so people, again, focusing on Maryland or Washington, D.C., they're actually consuming, right? They're not the producers of the oil, but they're consuming that oil. And so they do end up paying an externality for that, which also could lead to their own harm and their own detriment. So we want to keep that in mind, is that consumers also play a role in this by driving demand up, right? So they're the reason why New Jersey is refining oil in the first place. You also then have the pollution producer in states that are downwind. So just as much as New Jersey or New York produce pollution, well, so does Maryland, so does Washington, D.C., Florida, etc. And so what role should they play? Because they're also producing pollution as well. Then you've also got global consumers in this kind of globalized market world, right? So people all over the world can buy our refined oil, whether that's Mexico or whether that's Argentina or China, right? What role do they play? They obviously also increase the demand, and so should they and do they pay a certain amount to kind of reduce pollution, or are they just kind of paying to increase pollution? We also want to make sure we think about Congress, right, with voters and donors as their own economic actor, right? They have their own self-interest. They want to get reelected. So we want to think about what role do they play in mitigating economic damage. And then the next one is kind of a little complicated. So it's the Environmental Protection Agency, right, which falls under the executive branch or the president. And they're really what we call a self-referential subjective. And so what this means is they're not necessarily interested in the reduction of pollution per se. They're actually, kind of this agency that has its own costs and benefits that they have to think, what's it going to cost the EPA? So if they rule a certain way, they might not have as much power, so they might not be able to really do much in the future. So they have to weigh their own costs and benefits as they make decisions as well. And so that's always a subjective opinion. They're not objectively looking at the whole picture of pollution. They play a role in the pollution as well. And then finally, we have to look at the Supreme Court as kind of the system monitor. And this is the view of Justice Breyer. And it's really kind of this idea that they're the ones who kind of manage all of these other players, but obviously they have their own costs and benefits that they have to think about as well. Okay? And then the final idea I want you to think about as we go into this interpretation is that Becker and Posner remind us that most people are rather selfish in many areas of their activity, and it's perilous to ignore this when considering the design of public policy. So we can't pretend that humans are actually, these altruistic beings that really care more about saving the environment or reducing pollution than buying products, because it's just simply not accurate, right? We can see people littering, we can see people buying things that aren't necessarily good for them or for others, right? So we have to keep this in mind when we're designing public policy. So just to review, if I can pollute and you will pay for it, is this decision in the best interest of the citizens, the environment, the system of government, decision-making, or the economic interests of the polluter and consumer? That's what we really have to keep in mind as we go through and we identify each of the Supreme Court justices' kind of questions and answers. So we look at the Supreme Court as our evidence to see kind of how does this economic theory apply to an actual case. So this kind of first question we want to look at by Justice Scalia, and we'll remember he's an originalist, right? So he goes back to what would the Constitution originally say. So he says, does the fact that you begin with what the statute says in each upwind state, does that take account for its effect on the downwind states? But once having identified that effect, you then say those upwind states that can make the reductions more efficiently have to make more reductions than their proportion of the harm requires. So what he's really saying here is that if the law itself says that downwind states are the ones who have to make changes, then why do upwind states have to do it just because they have maybe a better economic position? And what he's really saying is that if Congress intended to make it clear in that sense, they would have written it this way. And you'll see down at the bottom it says the good neighbor provision. So there's kind of this question at the very beginning that Scalia is trying to get at, which is what did Congress intend to do? Did they intend for upwind states to be good neighbors, meaning that they'll pay for the damage they do to their neighbor? Or did they intend for downwind states, okay, to be the good neighbor? So then you have Justice Kagan, who has kind of more of a business background. She says, is the idea to the arguer for the EPA that the United States are required to do more than the states that haven't done much already? So the kind of question becomes here is that if a state has not done very much to reduce their pollution, should they have to do more? Or if a state has done a lot to reduce pollution, say like New York or California or Washington State, is it easier for them to reduce pollution? Okay, and so Justice Scalia responds real quickly right back, well, where does that say that? Where did Congress say that? Because it seems like, well, this is a question that's based outside of the Constitution. Okay, so you can start to see that Kagan is more of a contextualist. She's trying to take kind of the issue and understand how the best way to solve it is, whereas Scalia is really trying to keep it real simple to Congress and the Constitution. So the EPA responds that the purpose of the provision is not to allocate blame. Okay, so I'll say that again, right? He says that the purpose of the provision is not to allocate blame for an existing state of their non-attainment of the prior pollution. So that's a little complicated, but what he's saying is that just because a state has been bad in the past doesn't mean they can't be good in the future. Okay? And he said, for example, a $100 charitable contribution is more significant if it's made by a person who makes $10,000 a year than a $1,000 contribution by somebody who makes $1 million a year. So again, right, it's trying to say that even though a state might not have done much, so let's say New Jersey hasn't done much to improve their pollution standards, we're not going to hold that against them because it's a great thing for them if they make a huge contribution, this year, okay, even though maybe like New York has made a lot of contributions. So again, you see Justice Scalia, an originalist, push back against this, right? He says, well, this is the problem, the state-by-state requirement that makes it very difficult to think that all Congress wanted was the most efficient reduction of pollution no matter where the pollution comes from, right? Scalia is really kind of harking at this idea that, well, why would Congress pass a law that allows the Environmental Protection Agency to not give blame, but just to simply decide what the most efficient way to reduce pollution is? Why? And if they meant that, why didn't they just say that? Right, so the EPA responds. The first thing I would say is we can accept the premise that each state should alleviate no more than its share. Right, so saying that, if New Jersey contributes 25% of the pollution to New York, then they should pay 25%. And that each state should do no more than its share, and yet there still may be different ways of determining what a state's fair share is. Now, this starts to get a little confusing, obviously, and Scalia pushes back. If Congress wanted that, why couldn't Congress simply have said the EPA shall prescribe minimum pollution reduction measures that would be taken by the states? In other words, why not just give the power to the EPA to say, this is how much you have to reduce your pollution by next year? So now you see the EPA trying to really get away from this idea and say, well, the second point worth emphasizing is that there are state sovereign interests on both sides of the case, meaning that we have to remember, again, this is a federalist system. So the EPA simply cannot tell the state of New York that they must reduce their pollution by this amount because they don't have that power. That power is not in the Constitution. So you can kind of see Scalia setting up the EPA to say, oh, I see, so I got you, right? It's not in the Constitution what you're trying to do. So then, there's a different kind of argument line that Justice Chief John Roberts, who is a kind of originalist contextualist, although he probably refers to himself as a textualist, constitutional contextualist. So he's kind of saying, well, let's look at the text of the statute and try to make a determination of whether it's constitutional. And so the EPA gives the text by saying each state shall, after reasonable notice and public hearings, adopt and submit to the administrator of EPA within 3 years, or such shorter period as the administrator may prescribe after the promulgation of a national primary ambient air quality standard, which are called the NAAQS. I'll try to make that a little simpler by saying it's kind of like this, right? So the EPA kind of says, okay, all the states have to submit a report to us, and you've got about 3 years to do that, okay? And that's not too complicated, right? But Chief Justice Roberts says, yet you're saying, well, you got to do something within 3 years, or the EPA is going to do something. So then Stewart, again, right, as the EPA lawyer, says, well, that's how every legal context is. If one person acts and a second person is supposed to review that act, then of course the first person has to act. They have to send a report in before the EPA can really say what's going on. So you can see they're kind of drifting away from Scalia's originalist position and saying, well, okay, it's not as clear as just EPA says, hey, you got to reduce your pollution. It's more like there's this dance that they have to go through, right? So the state of New York or the state of Maryland has to send a report to the EPA has to review it, and then they kind of engage in this system where, okay, now we'll try to figure out what your share is. So you see this kind of shift again, but now Sotomayor is taking it in a different direction, right? So she asks about the Court of Appeals. So EPA says, well, the Court of Appeals could determine that, it's likely to happen or it's likely not to happen. And basically, they could say that this rule is arbitrary and capricious as to which state is not complying with the law. So in other words, we'll remember the arbitrary and capricious standard is all about due process. So if a state is given an adequate amount of time, and I'll just kind of, remind you here, or if you haven't read the case, right, most states actually don't submit the report, right? Because it's kind of like a trick, right? In a way, if you think about it. If I submit a report, then the EPA will say to me, oh, you've got to reduce your pollution by this amount. If I don't submit a report, then I don't start this dance, and I don't have to really do anything about it. So the appeals courts have said, well, you can't do that either, right? So you see Justice Sotomayor say, well, I think in the circumstance you describe, I think in the circumstance you describe, if you reach the conclusion that there was a theoretical possibility that this could happen and that it would be a problem if it did, but that the methodology used by EPA was on the whole rational, I think the task for this court at this stage is just to rule on the more big picture objections. So in other words, right, she's saying, okay, let's just say for a moment that a state does not file a report and the EPA then has to make a decision. Are there any objections to the EPA making this decision? So Stewart says, I think that's kind of an extraordinary standard for an administration agency to have to deal with. That is, it happens all the time. Okay, so it happens all the time, not just the EPA, but that all federal agencies are given some authority to regulate an issue or a problem, and that the regulation necessarily kind of affects other things. And so if we just put it on this arbitrary and capricious standard, then it's almost always going to be arbitrary and capricious because there's never going to be a clear kind of bright line where everybody's kind of cooperating with each other. So then you kind of just have this kind of final idea, right? And so, as the Chief Justice, Roberts kind of puts together, as you can see on the bottom here, 6 votes, of kind of an interesting group of people, right? So Ginsburg and Sotomayor are more of what we call a living constitution people. So they're more about like just what is the problem that we're trying to solve? The problem that we're trying to solve is to get states to reduce pollution. So Roberts says here, well, it's certainly hard, but it's what the statute says. And it seems to me that if the EPA had taken a different view, it would have been contrary to statute and thus, unconstitutional. So in other words, he's saying in the context of what Congress made a law saying that it's okay for the EPA to decide what level of responsibility each state has after they file a report, that is itself constitutional. And so you see Kagan and Breyer, who are the contextualists, and of course Kennedy always kind of is on one side or the other. They say, this is a reasonable standard, and that's the standard of review with this kind of legislation. Is it a rational thing that they're trying to do? And as long as it's rational, it will satisfy Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, as well as Article 2 of the Constitution, which allows the executive to enforce the laws. So if you think about it this way, Congress wants the states to reduce their pollution. The EPA is trying to make that happen. And so our originalist colleagues over here, Scalia, Thomas, and Alito, really don't have much to go on this case because it's fairly clear what the Congress wants. And so that's really what Scalia was trying to get. And what he's trying to do, and what the other two are trying to do, is limit the ability of the EPA to go outside of that very small kind of area. So in other words, if a state does not file a report, then under the originalist theory and under the contextualist theory that was decided in this case, then the EPA really has no power whatsoever. And so you can kind of see that working itself out now in the Trump administration. They don't really have to do anything, right? And so that's kind of the big issue here, is that, remember, the big problem that they've been trying to solve, and economics has been trying to solve for over 100 years, is how do we assign responsibility to polluters when it's not clear who's doing the pollution? Okay, and so what you get from this case is, they don't, right? They don't decide, okay? So we think about this now in kind of economics meets environmentalism. And so the Politics of Earth author says, when it comes to environmental affairs, if everyone is a rational egoist, meaning they make their own selfish choices, then the public, right, the commons, will always be abused. Polluters will continue to generate externalities that they don't have to pay for, and the government will do absolutely nothing to remedy the situation. And he wrote this in the 90s, so, this is kind of almost foretelling the future. But it's also, 100 years of governments just failing to act on this issue, largely because each actor has their own rational, selfish interest, and so there's not a good way to assign responsibility to people who don't want to have any responsibility. So then we'll go to The Tragedy of the Commons, which was written by a science professor, a long time ago in the 70s. And he said, we must admit our legal system of private property and inheritance is unjust, right? So private property is what actually pushes for this rational, egoist attitude. And so injustice is preferable to total ruin. So in other words, right, if we allow all private actors to simply just pass on the externalities to everyone else, right, there'll be nothing left. And so even though that would be unjust, right, against the private system, right, that's better than there being no system at all left, right? So there's kind of like balance that we have to strike about how are we going to assign blame when we have a system that doesn't allow for the assignment of blame, right? So he's kind of pointing that out. So then you want to think about this as like our point of view, right? We are not really represented in this argument, is because we're the ones who actually bear the physical harm, right? So we don't bear an economic harm in pollution, but we bear the actual physical harms of pollution. And so a modern philosopher in the book Living in End Times says the way to rid ourselves of our masters is not for humankind itself to become a collective master over nature. And that's the argument you hear, right? We're going to be conservers of nature. We need to master nature. We're the ones who have to protect nature. We need to save the planet, right? But instead to recognize just how ridiculous this notion is, right? That we clearly are not masters of nature, right? We are obviously not, and we're imposters when we make that assumption, right? Because we're clearly not good stewards. We're not any of the things that people kind of want us to be. And so we need to rid ourselves of that idea, right? That we are not masters of nature, and nature is not masters of us, but that we're kind of coexisting, and we need to figure a better way of kind of doing that. So I also want to just kind of give you an economic interpretation of the Constitution, right, by an economist named Beard, who said the constitutional economic system has two fundamental parts. Okay, the first is that a government is endowed with certain positive powers, but they're so constructed as to break the force of majority rule and prevent invasions of the property rights of minorities. That's what's going on right now, right, is that just because a majority of Congress or a majority of, let's say, leaders across the world, right, aren't willing to work on this, right, if it invades the property rights or the, individual life rights of minorities, right, us, then, the Constitution does give positive powers to kind of change that system. Okay, so you want to think about constitutional conventions, referendums, all sorts of different citizen-driven ideas that kind of force governments to act. And then second, there's restrictions on state legislatures, which have been so vigorous in their attacks on capital. So, this kind of argument that people say that, oh, that you're a communist if you say that we're going to restrict capital, well, it's absolutely ridiculous, right? Because the federal government has restricted capital over and over and over again. I mean, just this last banking crisis, right? There's all sorts of limitations on what banks can do. And so, it's kind of this non-argument that people make. It's a myth almost, so that somehow we can't reduce pollution because it would affect people's private property interests. I mean, we do it all the time, right? So it's kind of this just kind of crazy idea that certain people, right, largely climate change deniers, have put forward. Then we have to remember that the Constitution does not say that at all, right? So just keep that in mind. And then finally, we're going to just kind of hit two more economists, right? So Karl Marx, in his critique of political economy, said the economic conditions of production can be determined with precision of natural science and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out, right? So in other words, when people say we can't determine, right, that they're not being truthful, right? That's the whole point of science, right? Science is we can actually determine, we can determine tiny, tiny microscopic atoms, right? We can come up with theories that explain the universe, right? All these things. So when somebody says, oh, we can't solve pollution, right, they're just lying, right? And so we can put these in the context of legal, religious, philosophical, right? But we should use science, right, to make these arguments. And then finally, kind of finishing with Becker and Posner, our modern economists. If people believe that voluntary efforts will suffice to solve the problem of global warming, which, I'm sorry to say, at EcoFest we hear a lot of this, right? If you just reduce your carbon footprint, or if you recycle a little bit more, right, that everything will be okay. This is ridiculous, right? So there will be no political pressure, right? So if it's all on you, if it's all on me, if it's all on us, then the government will never act because it's, oh, you have to do something, right? And so we need government to incur the heavy costs that will be necessary to avert the risk of catastrophic climate change. And again, I think Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina are obvious of this, right? So, you have to prepare, you have to know if you're in a flood zone, you have to have a generator, right? Well, so what on earth do we need the government for is the question. So I just want to kind of end by this idea is that if we apply an economic interpretation to this environmental legal issue, we can see kind of the absurdity of how the government kind of tries to solve these problems, right? And that's not to say that there is no way to solve the problem, right? Economics has just showed you, along with science, that there's really a lot of different ways that we could solve this problem. But you see those arguments largely by the originalists that kind of throw the argument into kind of, almost absurdity.